All right, let's get started. This week's conversation, this topic is on intimacy directors. Another thing I realized they're also called is intimacy coordinators. So it's probably just a bit of vernacular. I'll go ahead and get us started. Uh, I have worked with an intimacy, I can't remember what we called it, might have been coordinator in the past for one show last year with a show that not only had a little bit of violence in it, but it was a make out, we're about to go have sex moment, but you never actually saw the sex on stage. With that, it kind of worked a lot like a fight director, which we'll get to later, in that the intimacy coordinator was there at the first read through, hearing what it was. We scheduled time with him because this one happened to be a male intimacy director coordinator. I will keep going back and forth because I don't quite remember the term we used on that production. And then we scheduled time with him, with the playwright, director, myself as the ASM, and the stage manager, just to like figure out what the director, kind of shape director wanted, plus how comfortable both sides were with it, because it was male female scene and moment. Luckily, it was the only time in the show where we really had any intimacy of that nature. Biggest thing with intimacy is consent, obviously, especially with a physical aspect. So figuring out like where is okay to touch. We had a lot where they wanted her underwear to come off on stage. So there was a second pair of underwear as well that could be taken off. Figuring out a suit jacket came off for him, a tie came off for him. So working with that was interesting, and just making sure like being pulled by the tie was okay before it came off, all of that. I know there's some topics of like with fight, intimacy is having like an intimacy captain whenever the intimacy director coordinator isn't there for us, because the nature of it, it was the production stage manager who spent a lot more time in the room with that. Sometimes me as the ASM, when I was doing that, I would be in the next room running lines with other people because they arrived early, or we did it where the other people had a little bit of break in the day, but they didn't necessarily want to leave. So while I was welcome in the room when they were working on it, I wasn't the main one who knew about it. To kind of helped, since our PSM always had a good view, or a relatively good view, of the intimacy based on that staging, whereas I didn't always, especially once we hit the run. Another aspect that we came across with our intimacy director was that there was a power dynamic in the room as well, which a lot of intimacy directors, at least from what I've heard from this particular person, as well as hearing a lecture or webinar from another intimacy director, is dealing with power in the room, especially when you feel like you don't have power. Our actor, the male actor, was particularly vocal and opinionated, and the actress was less likely to speak or express what she needed, how she was feeling. So big part with that was our intimacy director working with everyone else in the room and pinpointing that, and then trying to shift that balance so that the other voice is heard. This also kind of ties into another thing that is going around with intimacy directors, especially in this moment where we're dealing with so much of the systemic racism, not only in our country, but in our industry. There's been some calls, very few that I've seen, of having intimacy directors in the room pretty much as constant, because theater, what we do is so intimate, even if it's not quite sexual on stage, like kissing, all of that. So being able to have someone else who specifically looks at that and can help us regulate the power dynamics in the room is something that might be useful because they help list voices that might be more stifled, for a lack of a better term, and just make sure there is constant communication going on of what's okay, are you comfortable, is this sustainable? Because you don't want to have, and especially if it is like an intimacy choreography, you need it to be sustainable throughout the entire run and not be uncomfortable. Of course, some things may happen, but you don't want something that is more likely than not to be a problem. I know all of us have had moments where we haven't worked with an intimacy coordinator or director on a show where it really should have, like Spring Awakening. There's Intimate Apparel, which have several moments of that, which for us, not only was it the relationship of the husband and wife on stage, there's also a female-female kiss on stage that's interesting to deal with, not only in the room, but when the audience reacts to it, because you don't always see it coming. So there's that, and being able, while many people might think it's our job as stage managers to make sure everyone is comfortable and there is consent going on, sometimes that extra pair of eyes, especially when it's been figured out, is necessary. Also, we're not therapists. An image director is not a therapist either, so that's a completely other topic. But it does help to have someone who has trained in this, because there are a couple of trainings. Can't remember the organization right now, but it used to be through Intimacy Directors International, which has since closed down. And then there's another organization that does that. So us helping to support whoever is brought in, and perhaps even vocalizing when a production may need to bring one in. And with that, I turn it over, I think, to Lizzie there.
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about now is I have worked with a few intimacy directors who have also been the fight choreographer on the production. Sometimes they do specialize in both disciplines, meaning they are focused on one or the other, not trying to do both all at once. We'll take a day to do intimacy, we'll take a day to do fight choreography, or an afternoon or morning, because they are very specific and personal. I have, like Ingrid said, I've worked on several shows that haven't had an intimacy director, which I really wish the production had. I've worked on a lot of shows that deal with S&M, and I'm sure myself, the actors, would have been very grateful to have that security and direction, not from the director. I did work on one show particularly that it was about knot tying in S&M and how you can sexualize different knots. There were some issues on that show just with the script and the playwright, and I don't think they really realized, because intimacy direction, this was back in 2014-15, wasn't really talked about. Or they would have the fight choreographer do it, but that doesn't, just like any other discipline, just because you're stage manager doesn't mean you can do lighting design. Just because you're an intimacy director doesn't mean you can do fight choreography, and vice versa. So it is its own very specific craft. And I've also worked with fight choreographers who haven't always behaved appropriately. Not asking for consent to touch the actor before showing them the move. I did work on a show several years ago where the fight choreographer was fired after the first rehearsal because he just grabbed the actress, was dragging her, was doing other unprofessional, inappropriate things, showing her the movement. And you could tell she was uncomfortable. Everyone in the room was uncomfortable, and he was fired immediately. This choreographer. We didn't know that, of course, until we started working with him. This was going to happen, but everyone in the room could feel tension and was uncomfortable, and it was obvious. And when you bring a professional in, you expect them to do their job and not make anyone particularly the person they're showing the movement to, uncomfortable. And intimacy directors and fight choreographers, like Ingrid said, they're for everyone on the production, not just the actors who are learning the scenes and the movement. Because it's also on an emotional level and an intellectual level. They're there. I mean, you might do a show that you might never touch the other actor intimately, but emotionally there might be that connection they have to make, and how to navigate that throughout the process, especially in rehearsal, and then taking it into tech in a different space, different atmosphere, more people around, there's a bunch of lights booming on you, you're in your costume. So just it's a very specific art and a very specific craft. I've also had incidents with videographers. Most shows I work on here in New York are filmed, which is great that we can have that out there for everyone, but they might be putting a mic pack on the actors, right? I did a show off Broadway a couple years ago. Someone, it's always someone that's recommended. The videographer came in and was hitting on the actress. It was a solo show, so only one mic the entire time he was trying to work with her. I could see it. The producer could see it. You could see how uncomfortable the actress was. I had called a hold. I said, I just want to bring her into the office and talk to her for a minute, to the SM office. And I said, are you okay? And she said, no, I feel really uncomfortable. He's touching me. He's hitting on me. This is not a professional, comfortable environment. We asked him to leave. He was not asked back. So just anytime you have, and we did end up hiring someone the next day, nothing inappropriate, professional, asked if he could put the mic belt on her. He had different sizes of mic belts for her. So just when you're hiring people, intimacy directors, fight choreographers, videographers, if there's going to be any touching involved on a professional level, make sure there's consent, make sure that they're not there for ulterior motives. It's a clean, and that everyone who's in the room, everyone that's on the production feels safe and comfortable, because you never know what someone's motives might be. And I'm also going to turn this to Lisa and Taylor to talk a little more about fight choreographers.
I'll touch a little bit on intimacy. I did a show about 2.5 years ago where we did not have an intimacy coordinator. We had 3 instances in the show. It was a new play in development, so the script was constantly changing. Playwright was in and out of the room. One makeout scene, one scene where actor, male and female, kissed. And then the third section was about the actress who had to dress and act as a dominatrix in a hallucination dreamlike sequence. We spent the most time on the makeout scene. We had a female director. It was an interesting show in that most of the production team actually was female. Myself as the production stage manager, the ASM was female director. So when we started out with the makeout scene, it was the actor and the actress in the room, the female director, and myself. So at the time, I didn't think much about it. Now I look back on it and think, well, the man was outnumbered. How did he really feel in that room? But he was very open about saying to the actress from the beginning, this is completely in your hands. I will do what you feel comfortable with. If you don't feel comfortable with something, please say something. I want to make this as comfortable a situation for you as possible. Both actors were married. The actor's wife was an actress, so I will say he was probably a little more relaxed and open because his wife was like, yeah, I understand theater and how it goes. The actress, her husband was not in the field and did not feel that her husband would be comfortable, so there was a lot of discussion about what we were doing and what needed to happen. The director was very open about, here are the places that I want to hit, here's how I want the scene to go. But the actress was uncomfortable with that because she was afraid what her husband was going to think when he saw it. So having an intimacy coordinator certainly would have been helpful to help not only work out the physicality of that scene, but making sure that the actress was comfortable with the scene and how to speak to her husband about what was going on in the scene, and how that was part of the story, not her being with somebody else per se. That also translated into, she was also playing the scene where she had to dress and act as a dominatrix. She was very uncomfortable with it. She was basically handed a very skimpy costume that she felt uncomfortable with, and told, do what you feel like doing. And that was not a good situation for her. She didn't know what to do. She didn't feel comfortable doing a lot of the research. So that was kind of left to the director to give her some hints, to some of the other members of the production team, but it never quite got where she was completely comfortable in that sequence. Interestingly enough, the third part of that, where we had the male actor who we had in the makeout scene, had a scene later in the show with a different female actress who was much younger than he was, and not from the United States. She was a German actress who was here on a visa, had come to get her master's, had finished her master's, and was trying to see if she could get work here in the United States. That scene, easy peasy, because she was very comfortable with who she was. She was very comfortable in her own skin. And she was just like, yeah, come kiss me. Do whatever you want. Which actually kind of threw the male actor, interestingly enough, a little bit more. So that scene was a little easier. And it was also interesting to watch the dynamic from that German actress's standpoint, because once we got the shape of the makeout scene between the lead actor and the first actress, and we started having the ASM come back into the room, and then the other actors come into the room, and the German actress came into the room, she in some ways kind of jumped in and added some intimacy, coordination, or direction in some ways, because she was very open and very relaxed in her own sexuality and what she felt comfortable doing on stage, and offered hints when she would hear the director say, well, this is what I want and we're not getting that, what can we do? And so she would offer hints and kind of ended up doing a little direction, strangely enough. But I will say that none of those three sequences in the show ever got to where the director or the actors or the playwright wanted them to, and it was because we desperately needed an intimacy coordinator and did not have one. That was back in 2018, beginning of 2018. So intimacy coordinators were starting to come into the business, but not necessarily something that was, I think a lot of producers look at an intimacy coordinator as the last thing that they can afford. They'll hire a fight choreographer, they'll hire other people before they hire an intimacy coordinator, because I think that a lot of producers look at it as, well, directors have done this for years. They've directed people on how to do an intimate scene. Why do I need another person in the room that I have to pay for to direct that specific sequence? And I think that thought process is now changing with the moment and the Me Too movement, and the dealing with things like systemic racism in society and in theater, that we have to step forward as part of the production team and as part of our job in looking out for our actors and say, you do need somebody, and it's going to make your production better in the long run, and you're going to accomplish the storytelling you want to accomplish if you have someone that is trained in this area, who can work individually with the actors and can do it in a way that benefits the actors, the director, and telling the way the story is told. So I do think that that is something that we in this business need to work even more at, emphasizing those people are out there. It's becoming a better known job, and that if we see a scene or we see a show where we think this needs to happen, that we can support the director in advocating for an intimacy coordinator to come in. Taylor, you want to add? I know you've done Spring Awakening without an intimacy coordinator, am I correct?
Yeah, you are correct on that. And that is where a lot of things suffered for not having somebody else directing that, who actually was specialized in it. Ingrid and I worked on Spring Awakening together, and she was the PSM, I was the ASM, and I think it was even during my, it was sometime during pre-pro or during my interview even, or something. I know, if you know Spring Awakening, there's the part where Melchior and Venla are losing their virginity to each other, and it's front and center. literally front and center. So I had said, all right, well, when we get to that part in rehearsal, I'll just leave the room, because here I am thinking it'll just be our two leads in the room, and the director and Ingrid. And I said, all right, well, the PA and I can leave the room. There's a little lobby outside. We'll do something else. And then just call us back in when you're ready for us to come back in. Well, not only was it not just the two of them and Ingrid and the director, the entire company was there. So everybody was there, literally surrounding where the bed would have been. We didn't have a rehearsal bed. We just had, we had some cubes that we used every once in a while with that scene. And it was uncomfortable for almost everybody in that room. I don't want to speak for everybody, but it was uncomfortable. And I wasn't even the one who had to do any of it. So we went kind of separately and spoke with some of our actors afterwards, or during a break rather, and said, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? And they weren't. It was more that they were frustrated because they weren't getting the direction that they needed. They really weren't getting much of anything for that specific scene. And it is it's a technical scene, because what happened was we had them rolling over each other, and then they were on a bed that was on casters, so it was constantly spinning throughout the entire thing, and it was a twin size bed, so it's very confined. There's no room for, we did, make sure that elbows and knees were not hitting people in the face as best as we could, but it's hard to do that when you don't have the physical bed there until you get to the theater. And it's even harder to do it when it is the director who doesn't really have experience in that specific situation. And the scene never really got to where it should have been, frankly. We were not doing, there was no nudity either. So there was that. Because I know some productions will go that way. We chose not to. And it honestly suffered for not having a director specific to that, because we did have, I think our choreographer sort of chimed in a little bit there, but again, that's not her, it wasn't her forte either. And she actually wound up doing quite a bit more choreography on that show than she thought she was going to. It was okay, I guess, but again, it was not even, it was a thought that we had presented, or that Ingrid specifically had presented in early stages of rehearsal and pre-pro, and they just didn't go with it. And I think sometimes also it's not necessarily even that producers think it's not important. It's some of them just don't know about it either, because it is a newer thing. But that being said, it is a job. It is somebody's job now to do that. And the website that you were talking about before, Ingrid, is Intimacy Directors International, I think is the group that you were talking about before.
Yes, founded in 2016, I believe, but then stopped operation March of this year.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So yeah, that's there.
But there is another group. I just do not remember the name at the moment, but it does have to do with intimacy and that sort of aspect.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Taylor, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Gonna move on to choreography, regular choreography, but yeah.
Something I just wanted to add on about intimacy direction is, especially if there's any educators watching this, high school and college, you might be doing a show where to adults it might not be a big deal to see a little kiss. That might be a high school student's first kiss. I've heard many people as famous as Sutton Foster say her first kiss was on stage. And I remember, as we're talking about this right now, I did The Boyfriend in high school. I was in the pit orchestra, but that was the musical senior year. And the two leads in that show do share a kiss, at the end of the play. But I remember, like, during tech, they weren't doing it. And then we found out later it's because it was both their first kiss and they were nervous. And, so just keep that in mind, and that it's good to have a coach or director, choreographer, captain, to have those conversations during, if you're doing table work in high school and in college, because you never know, even as an adult, what someone may or may not have done in their personal life. And it's the same. So just keep that in mind, because it might not be a big deal to someone to see a small kiss, but the people doing it might be the biggest deal in the world, because it is intimate. A kiss is a very intimate, personal, private thing.
Yeah, as a former educator, I can speak to that as well. I had a student who was playing the lead for us in Cinderella, and she and the prince have a kiss, and she just pulled me aside. I had been teaching her for several years, and she said, I don't want to do this. I want my first kiss to be when I get married on my wedding day. And that's how I feel. That's my belief. So I don't want to do this. And so we said, okay, we'll work around this, and we'll coordinate, and we'll make it work in a different way. So you do have to be respectful of that. Yes, for a lot of young people, their first kiss is a stage kiss. Some of them now are thankfully more vocal about stepping up and saying, this is not the way I want it to happen. It means, it's important to me, means something to me, and how do we work around it? And I think we as educators and we as adults have to be the ones to say, okay, this is here, but we can change this. We can modify this. There are other ways there are other options, so that our young people that we work with feel comfortable to say, yeah, let's do it another way.
But even Spring Awakening is a good example, because Cinderella, The Boyfriend, that is just a stage kiss. Spring Awakening, as Taylor said, they are having sex or pretending to have sex on stage. That's a big deal for a high school student. I mean,
And I think that depends on where you are. I know in the South, where I come from, where I taught, I never would have breathed the word Spring Awakening to my principal.
Yeah,
I would have lost my job.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been necessarily growing up on Long Island a show they might have done either. But obviously there are
there are some that do.
That are more liberal about it, but it is a serious scene.
Because that's not even the only, sorry, just two thoughts. That's not even the only intimate moment in the show. We had two other kisses in the show, one male, the other older female to younger male. And then you also have a moment where one of the actors is supposed to be masturbating on stage. So how that handles, I will say with the case with me, it's Red Velvet. Not Red Velvet, Infinite Apparel, also done that one sometimes. For us, at least, the director was very much in the consent, like very technical when we were going through this. How do you feel about it? So with that, with who this director was, we were able to do it without an intimacy person, but that definitely is not the norm. I'm sure there's directors who really think they can. This one just happened to be, that was his style so much. So,
I mean, I was in college, we did Marat Sade, and if anyone is familiar with that show, there's a song called Copulation. So in 2010, 11, when I was in college doing this, we had a professional director, but we didn't have an intimacy director. Everyone was like, I guess we're just going to do what we're going to do. And it was not a polished or good looking scene in the show. But imagine if we'd had a professional intimacy director with us, how much more comfortable people would have been, how much rehearsal time would have been given to that scene. Because I remember spending very little time on that scene compared to the others. And it shouldn't be put aside just because of what the subject matter is about, what the song is about. It's an important scene in the show. And if someone isn't comfortable doing that scene, I mean, you can cut the scene potentially, or don't do the show. It's actually a very important scene in the show. So I wouldn't personally cut it, but thinking about what you're producing and who you're hiring and their comfort level. And intimacy directors are not just there, as I said, for the physical. I mean, emotionally, mentally. You might be doing a show that has to do with drug addiction, suicide, family issues. They're there to support everyone in that room and in that story as well. So it's good that there is conversations moving forward about bringing them in for the full time and not negating them as like a last minute budget decision, or we just don't even have a budget for that. They're an essential part of the team. They're an essential part of the production and the storytelling.
And I agree with what Taylor said, that I think there are a lot of producers and directors who just are not familiar with the concept of having an intimacy coordinator or director come in. And so for those of us that have been in situations where we felt we needed one, we now realize the importance of that job. But for those of us that are also familiar or have worked with them, we, I think, need to start stepping forward and being a better advocate for saying, I think this needs to happen. Our industry doesn't always have a good reputation, for good reason, when it comes to dealing with intimacy, whether it be on stage or off stage. And a lot of things that get swept under the rug. And I think that we have to step forward as part of the Me Too movement and other movements in this time period to say we need to be comfortable on stage with what we're doing if we're presenting a story. And everybody in the room needs to be comfortable. And it's okay to admit, I don't have this background or this expertise, and I'm going to bring somebody else in. And we need to support that and say, yes, it needs to happen.
Yeah, because the other thing is that it's kind of what Ingrid was talking about before, sustainability. It's one thing to do things, periodically in rehearsal, but then when you're doing it 8 shows a week, twice on Saturday, although maybe not anymore, maybe we're getting rid of 2 show days, who knows, after all of this.
Everything is all new.
One can hope. You have to be the person doing the whatever the act is, has to be comfortable doing it in front of hopefully a packed house also, because there's only so much you can raise up your own fourth wall and take yourself out of the situation, because people have vocal reactions. If they're not expecting something to happen, they may, if they're holding their soda or their snack, they may drop it at that point. If you've ever seen The Graduate, whoever's playing Mrs. Robinson disrobes pretty early on, actually. And I actually saw that, and then the man sitting next to me yelled out an audible "whoa," quite louder than I just did, but I don't want to blow people's ears. And again, she was front and center also. This was early 2000s, I think. So it was with Kathleen Turner and Jason Biggs. So this was before intimacy directors were really a thing. But it's something that they have to be comfortable doing, and they have to be okay with doing every single show.
I mean, something to remember before we go back to fight choreography is whether it's the script or your blocking or intimacy direction or fight choreography, no is a full sentence. If there's something that you just aren't feeling or have a question about, just say it. Just speak up and say no. I mean, we've talked about that a lot over the last several months. No is a full sentence, and you should feel comfortable with that, especially in a room working on very intimate productions and scripts. So Taylor's going to talk a little more about fight choreography.
Yeah, I think we're gonna, and it's similar in the way that, again, it needs to be sustainable. You have to be able to do it every show the same way every time, and safely every time. Because if you are, it can be as simple as someone is hitting you, and you've got someone off to your side doing the nap, so there's not any actual contact, but it still needs to be the same repetitive thing every single time, and it needs to hit when that object is hitting you in the face. That nap needs to happen at the same space. It can also be someone literally throwing you across the stage, so that needs to be, and then that's also where your wardrobe people will come into play and see where padding needs to happen and where things on the stage need to be placed and or padded as well. But the instance that I've dealt with fight choreography was with Midsummer Night's Dream, which there's a pretty big cat fight between the two ladies that the two men kind of are off to the sides and watching when they're in the forest. And in this case, we were on this was a Shakespeare in the Park. The deck itself was a masonite deck that was on metal scaffolding. So it was pretty slick when it was dry, even. And then we added mulch to it because it was being thrown. So there's also that. You want to make sure that those ladies don't get mulch in their eye, because that's not, it happens. It's dirt and it's wood. So you try to make sure that there's nothing aimed toward their face. It's always lower down. And again, you have to make sure that these people are okay doing what they need to do, because there's a lot of crawling around on that stage. It's a masonite deck. It's not soft. So they had knee pads, which were in full view of the audience. And that's just the way that it was, because their protection is more important than that. And if you can't suspend your disbelief for a second, well, that's kind of on you. But yeah, our fight choreographer was actually our director, because she has experience in it. And she worked with the actors specifically and said, are you okay with doing this? If this doesn't work, we'll try something else. And we did. Things got modified. There was also a rake stage. There was a crescent moon part that jumping off of and onto happened. That actually was padded. And our Demetrius was our fight captain, because he had done this he had done so before, and he volunteered to do it again. And I wound up being the second set of eyes for this. So he was in the scene, but he was far enough removed from it that it worked. He was able to watch it every single time. And what he would do was, in rehearsal, when we were first starting out, he would have them sort of do it at quarter time, and then we would build up every time they did it again. And then the next day, or the next time we did the scene, again, we started it slow and we worked back up to it until we were in performance. We would do the rehearsal, the fight call, work up to speed, and then performance time. It was at full speed. He also had quite a few scenes with Hermia, where he was either dragging her or being hit by her. And they were boyfriend and girlfriend and actually do live together, so that made it even more fun. They were great. It worked out really well. But he was very much able to remove himself from the actor part of it too, and tell them what parts didn't work for him, because he actually had a neck injury. So Hermia, when she jumped up onto his back, it had to be done in a very specific way for him, and he had to speak out what that way was a couple of times, and he did. So that's how we wound up working that. It was, we would run our fight calls at the top of the show. They would go finish getting dressed. They would usually do their fight calls in their knee pads and their shoes, and then go finish putting their costumes on afterwards. Because again, it was Shakespeare in the Park, so pretty much everything is in full view of the audience. They were in character the second they came out. There was a back wall that had sort of a mesh covering on it. So the second they cleared that, they were whatever character they were playing at the time. And at least I didn't hear anybody over mics backstage or anything like that, because I was out front under a tent, which was under a tree, with the audience basically. So I'm sure the audience heard me call that show, but oh well. But yeah, no, there was a couple of times where, because like I said, the deck was slick on a good day, our Lysander went sliding one day, from, I don't even remember what he was doing. It wasn't anything spectacular, but he slid and he got back up and, did his scene. And then when he exited, I sent my assistant to go backstage and just check on him just in case. But, anything, again, you run the choreography to make sure that stuff goes as smoothly as possible. And then if and when it doesn't, you go check and make sure that that person's okay or those people are okay, and then you deal with it in that moment. Because we even had during Spring Awakening, it wasn't a fight call, but it was a safety call for Totally Fucked, where the trick chair, it would happen once in a while during our calls where Melchior wouldn't get enough weight over the chair to make it tip all the way forward. So it would go back into its regular chair position, and he was okay until the one time on a 2-show day when he, again, didn't get enough forward momentum and the chair started going back and then just went out from under him. And he landed in sort of like a push-up position, which if that man was not as muscular as he is, we probably would have had more of a problem than we did. He hurt his wrist a little bit, but it was barely anything compared to what it could have been. I was actually more worried about his teeth because he landed with his chin to the floor. But it was, again, that was something that he literally bounced back up. He barely missed a beat, kept going. And then when he was off stage, we all checked in with him and got him an ice pack, and you continue with the show. And we all know that we're on an extended intermission now, quote unquote, but you can't be afraid to stop the show if something does go wrong. Because yes, the show does go on eventually, but not at people's expense. So,
I mean, when I was in college, a friend of mine, we were doing fight choreography, and he broke his collarbone during the scene, and we didn't know until after. He went backstage and said, "I need to go to an emergency room," and we of course took him, and he got his cast and everything, and he ended up performing the rest of the shows with it, which was fine. It didn't ruin anything. But I mean, of course, I wish he had said something, and we were in college, so of course he didn't. But he got hurt. I mean, breaking a collarbone is no joke. That's weeks of PT and recovery. So yeah, don't stop the show. And sometimes audiences love that. It's exciting when a live show stops. Like, oh, I get to be a part of this. What's happening? We didn't expect this. I mean, not a good thing, but they won't be upset. They're not going to get out of the theater and leave and walk out. They're gonna be like, well, what's going on? So,
Actually, 8 years ago now, was ASMing. Really wasn't nowhere near the deck because I was up in the catwalks for a cue coming up. As the ASM, we had a sword break on stage as part of one of the sword fights, a show called Tony Kushner's, or The Illusion, freely adapted by Tony Kushner from Pierre Corneille. But we had a sword fight, and probably near the end of Act 1, where they were like fencing rapier swords, and it for some reason just broke and went towards the audience, luckily under their feet, but getting close to the audience. So yeah, hopefully you have a good props maintenance program, because I know I've done a lot of shows with weaponry like Shakespeare's, Richard III, Hamlet twice, Othello, things like that, and those types of things. Being able to keep track of those swords and maintenance those swords, especially a number of times during Richard III, we had sparks come off the swords, which means burrs, which either they're hitting too hard or probably hitting too hard, and we weren't able to maintenance the swords if they hit too hard during the show until the end of the show. Because there's no time, especially with that show. We had 10 broadswords, and I think up to 13 people who, through the course of the show, needed to grab a broadsword. So there was a lot of tracking there.
Yeah, I've worked on a lot of shows with weapons as well, and more specifically, I've worked on a lot of shows with guns that have blanks in them. Just any show you work on, whether it's a sword, a gun, a knife, you are not joking around with that, off stage. You're just using it in the moment. If you have to preset it, you know where it is. They're not touching it any other time. It's locked up away. The first show when I was at Williamstown several years ago, we did The Importance of Being Earnest, which they did in the 30s. So there were a lot of gangster gun shoots at the end, which it looked really cool and it worked for that version. But we did bring in a specialist. Everyone at the festival went for gun safety protocol. And he talked about how, even though we're blanks, people can get killed if you actually like shoot it a certain way. He talked about how on a few Westerns in the early 50s it had happened. Not as much recently, but that doesn't mean you aren't careful in remembering that. But it can happen with blanks. It can happen with fake knives and swords and weaponry. So you need to do it so precisely and carefully every time, or you never know when you could really hurt someone.
Yeah, and their general rule of thumb with the guns, you don't point them directly at a person. It's over a shoulder.
Yeah.
It's not, because accidents happen. Things do happen. That we don't live in a perfect world.
It's the risk you take.
Yeah. So when there are blanks involved, blanks are actual bullets just packed with something else, without the gunpowder. So
yeah. And I come from an educational background, so my philosophy always was, if we're dealing with, whether it's dealing with swords or guns, you're dealing with it as if it were a real thing that could potentially kill someone, whether there's a blank in that gun or not. I want you to think that there is, so that you learn how to treat it that way, so that if you continue in this business and you're handed a gun at some point that has a blank in it, you already know how to treat it.
Yeah, I actually worked on a show in college. We had a blank, and I kind of thought to myself, I can't believe the school is allowing this, but they pointed it up, even though, what could go through the ceiling. But it happened, and it was safe, and it was a lockbox for the 2 performances. I won't say the name of the production, but I did see a Broadway musical several years ago about war, and they were in the audience with guns. They were pointing the guns at the audience. Never do that. You do not need a gun in the audience. You do not need to be pointing at the audience, though they know it's fake, or they should know it's fake. You never know what is scary, because I was personally scared that they were in the audience with that. They were pointing at it. It's just unnecessary, and it doesn't help the story or the production.
something that should
Just
be.
out of curiosity, Lizzie, was there a warning about that?
Yeah, that's what I was.
I mean, I don't I'll tell you when we're off the call.
Okay.
What show it is. I don't remember if there definitely was not like an announcement at the beginning. I do remember there was no, and I wasn't late. I was there on time. There was definitely no announcement. I don't remember if there was a slip, like in the program. You have sometimes put like a little slip, like saying there's an actor out or whatever. But I don't think there was. I'd have to dig out my playbill, but I'm pretty confident there wasn't. I mean, if you know the show, you know what it's about. It's not going to shock you that there's weaponry in it. I didn't care that there was I didn't mind it. I shouldn't say care. That's horrible. It was called for. You do need the weaponry to tell it. It just wasn't executed professionally or safely, in my opinion. The show also closed rather quickly. Not so. It did. But even working on Ernest, I didn't feel uncomfortable. When it was so well done, so precise, so specific, so much safety protocol. And the interesting about Ernest, they only really used it at the end. It was kind of this big like hullabaloo that they were kissing while shooting, but like the actor, you couldn't see it from the audience, but if you were in the room in tech, one of their eyes was always open. So it was very precise and interesting, and I had never seen it before. And so what the director did on that, I really respected and appreciated. That it wasn't just like, oh, they're kissing and closing and blowing, shooting off guns. You can one eye is open, her eye is open. It's not pointed at someone's face. It's pointed in specific targets, and there was never an issue on that show. But this Broadway show, it was immensely uncomfortable to watch, knowing it wasn't just one rifle in the audience. It was several, because it's soldiers. They all had guns shooting each other. So yeah, It can happen on Broadway, it can happen off Broadway, it can happen regionally. You got to be careful.
Yeah, and there are general rules that you have to follow, especially when weapons are involved, such as guns and fake knives too. Any collapsible knife, you obviously want to make sure that is not mixed in with the actual knives that are on stage, because you don't want to mix those two up. There was Broadway Bound. I was doing a show called Saving Stan, where there's a gun. It's not loaded with anything. It was a sound cue that was the gunshot, but the gun itself was a weighted gun, and that immediately had to go back into the lockbox after the show was over. That being said, you need to make sure, you as a stage manager need to make sure whoever is dealing with that lockbox, who has the key for the lockbox, if it's not you, is accessible right away at the end of the show. Because I had an issue where, I can't leave the theater. I still have the gun with me. And my, was the festival director for that space was not there, or she was in the lobby or something. And I was like, hey, come here. You're the one that told me that I got to do this. And I was going to do it anyway. But that you need to make sure that everybody knows when that show ends, and knows that when that show does end, that gun is their responsibility.
Yeah, I had the same situation. I know exactly what you're talking about, Taylor, because I also did Broadway Bound.
Yeah.
The same space, probably the same year. And we had guns in our show too. So, and I do remember her instruction of, you cannot leave the space until this is taken care of, which also leads to something that, of course, happens a lot here in New York, but can happen anywhere. When you're rehearsing with those guns and you're not rehearsing in the same space every day, who is taking care of that lockbox, and where is it going if it cannot be stored in the space, or if you're changing spaces? Because that is certainly not something, particularly in New York City, that you want to be carrying around, because it can get you in a whole lot of trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And I know we had a lot of issue on the particular show I did for Broadway Bound, in that we used two different rehearsal spaces, and one of those spaces would not allow us to even store the gun box there. And so it became a discussion between myself and the fight choreographer who had provided the guns, as to what we were going to do with that lockbox, and where it was going to go, and how it was going to get to rehearsals. And thankfully, he stepped up and said, look, this is what I do for a career. I have all of the necessary stuff with me to say, this is my career. These are mine. They're labeled correctly, with the orange tips and all that stuff that now has to happen. And so he took that responsibility, and I was glad, because I didn't want that responsibility.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. So that is something that you also need to think about in pre-pro, is if we're using weapons, where are they going to be stored? Who's responsible for them? And if they have to move to multiple rehearsal spaces, who's in charge of moving them?
Yeah. And also, there was an instance where I was actually the prop person for it was for the Argyle Theater. Ingrid and I both worked there, and that's where Spring Awakening happened. It didn't even have anything to do with the show. It was for Guys and Dolls. Yes, there's a gun in Guys and Dolls. It was a separate thing though, where somebody just dropped off a bunch of stuff that they had, like, in their attic, and they were getting rid of it because that's how some places do acquire their props. So going through it, they found that they are fake, but there were guns in there, in like a cardboard box in the lobby. So they were trying to talk to myself and the stage manager for that show, like, what do we do with this? And I was like, well, first off, get it out of the lobby in view of everyone. Let's bring it up to the office. And second, you have to bring it to a gun store to have it looked at. And because if you do want the gun to fire blanks, there are modifications that need to be made to it. It's not the same thing as an actual gun trigger. You don't want that power when you're firing blanks. There's something that I don't know what it is that they have to do. That's why I'm not the one that does it. but yeah, you have to take it to a professional to have it looked over, make sure it's cleaned properly as well. Because that is part of the problem when you're firing blanks. If it's not cleaned properly, things get stuck. And that's where bad things can happen. But you can also have a situation where you're using umbrellas as swords, and those break too. I'm a big proponent of using things for what they are. Use an umbrella as an umbrella, please.
I mean, we did realize that because we knew pretty early. So what with that?
Yeah.
With those umbrellas, because Peter and the Starcatcher, which is very creative, also has fight choreography. Also, we had a lot of lifts in that show, but that's its own world, especially if you don't have a specific choreographer, which we really did have a separate choreographer. At least we knew how many umbrellas were actually going to be weapons and spent some time like, okay, this cannot open, has to be glued shut, support in there to do that. And they were tracked completely differently than the ones that would be more like shields held up as an umbrella, twisting, turning. Okay, do not. I know several times in the rehearsal before we even got to the stage with so many umbrellas between myself as the ASM and the production assistant, it was making sure, okay, we're doing the scene, don't grab that umbrella. Here's this one with the tape, grab it, making sure it got to their hands. Because even in rehearsal, that would be bad. And especially taking care of also in that show, there is like a switchblade knife kind of thing that also we had to be able to take care of as well and had duplicates for.
And be aware when we talk about switchblades, there are some states, some towns, municipalities who do not allow you to have an actual, even if it's blunted, switchblade that you use.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's the same for guns.
Yeah.
I think we weren't quite switchblade. We were more like barber razor. Sorry, it was more of a barber razor, not a switchblade.
Yeah.
Still, that you could kill someone with it.
That was
yeah.
Right, because I was prop master for that to begin with and crew, and then think people got switched around. So you bumped up to PSM, I bumped up to ASM. Right, she used a different blade than what we had used in Guys and Dolls because for Guys and Dolls, I think Hairspray. I did props for Hairspray, where Seaweed is supposed to switchblade Penny out of her well, it was a chair, but the ropes. We couldn't get that because there are also certain knives that you can't have things delivered to New York, which so but they have the greasers comb, comb, and you just you put some tin foil over that or aluminum foil over that, and you got a fake switchblade. And that's
the little things we've learned along the way.
But yeah, that was, I forgot it was a different blade for that. Yeah.
But anyone doing like Sweeney Todd, be careful.
Yeah.
Like in all seriousness, seriously though.
Yeah, and as a stage manager, you need to be coordinating with whoever your props person is that's in charge of those weapons to make sure you're all on the same page, that they're clearly marked, that communication with your actors is clear as to who's responsible for what, where it starts, where it ends, how it's tracked, all of those things. And I know we talked a lot about intimacy directors and fight choreography here. Most of you are probably familiar with, if you've dealt with a fight choreographer, that we have a fight captain. And in a show where it's a small cast show, or you may only have one fight scene that has 2, maybe 3 people, sometimes as a stage manager or an assistant stage manager, you may be asked if you would like to be the fight captain. I've had that happen to me twice here in New York. I do have taken some stage combat over the years when I was teaching and did some work in stage combat. So I feel comfortable doing it in a small show where I have 2 people dealing with a very simple fight scene. There is extra pay for that under equity contracts. So that's a nice little padding in your check. But that may be something along the way, if particularly if you have some stage combat background, you may be asked to do. I have a former student who is certified in 2 areas of stage combat, who works as an ASM, and a lot of times will act as a fight captain for that reason, because he has that training. So if that's an area of interest for you and you might like to do that, that is another option as well, being fight captain.
The fight captain also, if they're a separate person from you, are they're another person's opinion that you can get. And by that I mean, for Midsummer, we wound up having to cancel our last performance because we were having we knew the day before basically that we weren't going to be doing the next day's show, but we couldn't call it yet. It was for weather reasons, because like I said, that deck was slick on a good day, and then that next day we had a deluge come down. Yes, the deck, it had been covered. Things have been covered. You have lighting instruments that are susceptible to the elements. Everything that could be covered was, but tarps got moved. It was windy. Things happened, and the deck got wet. The deck got soaked. So I had spent 2 or 3 hours trying to squeegee the deck, and all you're seeing is all the oils coming up from the floor. And we had our director very much did not want to cancel the show. I knew her. She was one of my professors from school, so I had that relationship with her already, but also she was not part of the decision making. And this is the reason why directors are not part of that decision making, because it's their baby and they want to do it. And we did too. You don't want to cancel a show if you don't have to, but it was myself and the other equity members. I had them come up and look at the deck and see, this is as best as I could get it in the last couple of hours before the show started. Plus we knew that it was supposed to, lightning. There was supposed to be a lightning storm later that day. And I think that would have brought us about half an hour or so into the show. And that's around when the fight scene, the big fight scene happens. And, where it's a metal stage, I'm under a metal tent, which is under a tree. It wasn't in our favor. But then we waited before we made our final decision until the fight captain got there, because I wanted to know what his opinion was of the deck and doing that scene, and all the dragging scenes and stuff like that. And we wound up calling the show off. I think 6 people showed up because they didn't get the memo that day or something that it was supposed to be terrible out. But that's a decision that they can help you make. Do you do it or do you not do it?
I have kind of a fun question. Since we're kind of on the fight side of it and a little bit with props, what's the most unusual prop that you've had part of a fight or a fight call? Since we're getting close to the end of this today.
We're about there.
I've had some odd ones.
I've got a couple that I'm like, I can't tell you which one's the most unusual here.
I think for me, I did the knot show. There was what they called a monkey knot, which was relatively long, supposed to look like a phallus knot. Also very heavy. And that was used in a fight/intimate moment of the play. How it was written, that part of the staging was always fine. We did rehearse it for I think we had 5 performances for Fringe. That's definitely one of the odder ones that I can think of.
Are you talking about just fight call or during the show?
I would go with either one.
Because I was going to say, I did a show that was part of the Brits Off Broadway Festival, which they didn't have a fight call for, because their rules are just different there.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of food that was in the show that wound up getting thrown around the entire deck. I think it was probably chickpeas and lentils.
Oh. That's good. Not smell good after 2 shootouts.
Yeah.
The cauliflower was worse.
Oh.
I would say I probably have 3 that are kind of tied. Pineapple, Peter and the Starcatcher, so that. Garden tools, so like a rake and a shovel we had. And then in the fight call, it ended up, so we used a hot sauce bottle, not actual hot sauce, but because the bottle was supposed to break and we specifically ended up fight calling this, we used a koosh ball every day. So that was probably one of my most unusual.
I haven't had to deal with food, just, fallacy looking knots is one of them.
Yeah. Lisa, you got anything?
No, I guess it's my years as being a teacher. It's just guns and swords mostly, and food. I mean, I've done shows with food. I did a show last year. As a matter of fact, Carolina was my ASM. You guys know Carolina works with us with the Symposium. But that we had a lot of food, and we had to make some changes off and on through the process because of I think some food allergies that we had to address in the beginning, and then some just particularness of actors who were like, I don't like the taste of this. Can we switch this to something else that will give the look we want, since I have to eat it, but I can tolerate it. And that food prep was forever, because we had so much food and drink and wine glasses going here, there, and everywhere. And a lot of it was actually stored on stage in set pieces to make things easier. But the 2 actors that dealt with the props the most, literally had a long list that was part of their, they would go around behind Caroline and I check their presets to make sure, because it was so complex.
Yeah, I'm the writer that doesn't write very many food props into her shows.
That sounds like a topic for another panel. Food
Something
on stage.
Dealing with food.
Yeah, something I do want to add about intimacy direction before I wrap up is, if you don't have an intimacy director in the room, advocate for one, because as a stage manager, you might have to stand in for those scenes. I've had to, and very long time ago, I stood in. No, mostly when I do have to stand in and there's a kissing scene, we just high five. That's what you do. One time an actress did kiss me, and everyone started laughing because we didn't know what was going to happen, and she kissed me for other reasons that she knew she wasn't supposed to, and did it. And it made me uncomfortable in the moment, and it shouldn't have happened. But advocate for it, and, high five, always appropriate if you do have to do that, or a fist pump, or I guess in the world of COVID, we might still have to, or a head nod, who knows. But yes, so just advocate for those professionals, because how would you feel? It's just how you think of it. And if try to get that point across to the producers and directors if it's not brought up before you're hired.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a pretty good place to leave off.
Cool. Well, thank you all.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.